Segregated mid-century America. Mississippi, its epicenter.
Friends, I'm a Mississippi segregationist, and I am proud of it.
A land steeped in racist violence. From this context emerges one man who will risk his life to fight for his beliefs.
I had engaged in a war against the system of white supremacy.
There was no guarantee in September of '62 that Meredith was going to come out of this alive.
To achieve his ends, he will trigger the largest domestic mobilization of U.S. troops since the Civil War.
The situation is bad. The marshals are still firing tear gas shells and exploding all over the place.
I started hearing thuds against the side of the truck, and it turned out they were throwing rocks, Molotov cocktails.
A largely forgotten hero who single-handedly instigates some of the most significant victories of the civil rights movement. Yet he is a complex man.
It had always been my belief that my job was to restructure the world because I didn't like nothing, including most of the time, I didn't like James Meredith.
What I thought about was, what a brave man, or either he's crazy as heck.
A civil rights icon who rejects the term.
Civil rights is an insult to citizenship. Every citizen in the United States is entitled to every one of those rights.
Throughout it all, he marches to the beat of his own drum. Sometimes controversial.
He's a loner. He doesn't care what people say about him.
I always thought that my job was to lead the people to equality.
This is the story of James Meredith, an American original.
The word that immediately comes to mind is rebel.
It took me about 20 years to understand what the heck James was talking about most times.
He makes you think. He makes you scramble your assumptions when it comes to American history, when it comes to race.
He was born in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. The family farm is pivotal in shaping his outlook.
My father was going to sell the farm, and he wanted to give me first chance to buy it. There was really nothing to consider. Unlike what is generally thought, I was born in privilege. My family owned lots of land. I was born in 1933 in the heart of the American Depression. But we didn't live like poor people.
Because of the way we grew up. We didn't grow up thinking we were inferior to anybody or anything.
Across the South, white supremacy kept most blacks disenfranchised. Nowhere is segregation more brutally enforced than in Mississippi.
You see, the other thing that was significant about my growing up was the isolation. I spent most of my time just roaming my father's 84-acre farm, totally by myself. As a matter of fact, I was 15 years old before I knew that black was supposed to be the bottom end of the deal. We visited our relatives in Detroit. And when we got ready to come back, we came back on the train. And when we got to Memphis, Tennessee, the conductor came back and told me and my brother we had to move to the black car. And I had to stand all the way from Memphis to Durant, Mississippi. And I cried all the way. And I promised God that I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to change that.
He had been raised by a father who was like a biblical character of strength and brilliance. And that father said to James Meredith, "You are the chosen one. You are going to change history.
In 1950, Meredith enlists in the newly integrated Air Force.
Now, when he got out of school, what did he do?
He had to wait a few days till he was old enough to go in service, and then he went on in service in the Air Force.
As James serves, the fight for black equality is heating up, and education is the primary battleground. In 1957, 9 black students attempt to enroll in the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Eisenhower, under pressure from the NAACP, mobilizes federal troops to enforce their right to attend the school. James, now stationed in Japan, follows the story closely and with interest.
He saw what happened in Little Rock in 1957, and that was American combat troops delivering justice for American school children.
When Meredith leaves the rapidly integrating world of the military, he returns to a Mississippi still mired in inequality. He makes a decision that would change history.
I came back with the plan to force the federal government into a position where they had to use the military might to support my rights of citizenship.
No black student had attended the University of Mississippi in its 113-year history.
James, why do you want to enter the University of Mississippi?
I think that every citizen should have an opportunity to receive an education in his own state.
He took the system on. He took it on. When you think, I think about a guy who was bold, courageous, smart, marched the beat of his own drum.
The University of Mississippi, it was the symbol of white supremacy. The thought at that point of a black person enrolling and attending that school was, beyond the imagination of so many people.
James saw an opportunity in recently elected President John F. Kennedy.
John Kennedy was a senator from Massachusetts that had never even thought about the black issue, but he knew the political power of the black-white issue. The day he got inaugurated, next day I dropped my letter in the mail.
Ole Miss sends an encouraging response, and James replies,
I'm very pleased with your letter that you recently sent to me. I sincerely hope that your attitude toward me does not change upon learning that I am not a white applicant.
Within days, Ole Miss responds. James will not be allowed to register. He knows his campaign will end up in the courts. For that, he will need legal support.
It was Medgar Evers that first suggested that I contact the NAACP, of which he was the top person in the state of Mississippi. He put me in touch with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
In 1954, the Legal Defense Fund had won the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which explicitly outlawed racial segregation in public education. For 16 months, attorney Constance Baker Motley pushes Meredith's case. In September 1962, the Supreme Court rules that Ole Miss must admit James Meredith.
I had engaged in a war against the organized power of the state of Mississippi.
Meredith's war is about to enter a new, far more dangerous phase.
Go home, nigger. Go home, nigger.
September 1962. The University of Mississippi is on high alert. James Meredith has chosen to fight his battle for black equality by challenging Ole Miss to enroll him as its first African-American student. But the forces opposing him stretch far beyond the university administration, all the way to the state's governor, Ross Barnett.
My father was born way out in the country in central Mississippi, 1898. He was born, as he said, 60 miles from a railroad and 60 miles from a bank. Then he went to law school at Ole Miss. My father liked black folks, but he believed that the Lord made white folks, black folks, yellow folks, red folks, whatever. And that was an intention of the Lord.
And Barnett had run for governor on an explicitly racist platform.
Friends, I'm a Mississippi segregationist, and I am proud of it.
Ross Barnett was afraid of being killed politically the moment that the sun rose on the day that Meredith goes to school. He was desperately trying to salvage his own career.
Days after the Supreme Court decision in Meredith's favor, Barnett draws a line in the sand.
I have said in every county in Mississippi that no school in our state will be integrated while I am your governor.
The state of Mississippi is now in open rebellion against the federal government. Both sides know the face-off could lead to bloodshed, and at the middle of it all is James Meredith.
I think there were those within the civil rights community who understood how significant this moment was. I think there were others who understood how dangerous this undertaking was. There was no guarantee in September of '62 that Meredith was going to come out of this alive.
I expected to be killed.
On September the 20th, Meredith arrives at Ole Miss.
All the students were out there. They were cussing and all of that. First he asked, which one is James Meredith? And I was the only black anywhere on the campus.
Barnett refuses to admit Meredith.
He was doing everything he could legally, and some may say illegally, to keep Meredith out of Ole Miss.
Meredith's legal team obtains a court order prohibiting Barnett from blocking Meredith's attempt to register.
Miss Motley, what's going to be the procedure for tomorrow?
Well, Mr. Meredith is going to go over to Jackson and register.
Do you expect that the board will comply?
They told the court they would.
Do you anticipate any difficulties tomorrow?
No, I don't.
On September 25th, Meredith tries again, confronting Barnett at the state office building in Jackson.
James Meredith has just arrived in the custody of federal officials and apparently making his way up to the 10th floor to register.
Here he comes now. Patrol asking us all to back up.
Just back up, everybody, please.
To James H. Meredith, applicant for admission as a student at the University of Mississippi. I, Ross R. Barnett, governor of the great and sovereign state of Mississippi, interpose the sovereignty of this state and do hereby now and finally deny you admission to the University of Mississippi.
Again, he has to endure this ridiculous dance where the state says, no, we're not going to register you.
President Kennedy attempts to reason with Barnett.
The problem is as to whether we can get some help in getting this fellow in this week.
Yeah.
In the first place is the court's order to you, which I guess is you're given until Tuesday. What is your feeling on that?
Well, I want to think it over for a few days.
While Barnett stalls, white supremacists pour into Oxford.
You must be aware that your very life may be at stake when you walk onto that campus.
Well, everyone's life is at stake at all times.
September 26th, Meredith makes a third attempt.
But there to meet them, instead of Governor Barnett, was Lieutenant Governor Paul Johnson.
We have told you that you can't go in, and we intend to use whatever force you exert on us.
The marshals tried to find an opening while the Mississippi police kept moving to block their path. In the end, the federal marshals turned back with their candidate, and James Meredith is still barred from the campus of the University of Mississippi.
President Kennedy consults with Solicitor General Archibald Cox.
Morning. The only question I had was whether there are any additional proclamations or powers, etc., that we might need in the Mississippi matter if it gets worse, and where we are legally on arresting people, including the governor if necessary and others.
Governor Barnett is found guilty of contempt and ordered to clear himself or face arrest and a fine of $10,000 per day. That weekend, as Kennedy ponders his options, Barnett joins thousands of Ole Miss students at a football game against Kentucky. Standing at the 50-yard line at halftime, Barnett remains defiant.
I love Mississippi. I love her people. I love and I respect our heritage.
The next day, thousands of U.S. troops mobilize for a showdown in Oxford.
That was my only concern, was what the United States military was going to do. And the President of the United States and his advisors were the only people that determined that. And those were the only people I even thought about.
Meredith's confrontation with Barnett has become a constitutional crisis, and it is about to escalate further. By Sunday, September the 30th, thousands of white supremacists have arrived in Oxford.
Several hundred federal marshals fly into Oxford, armed with tear gas and sidearms.
The marshals take up positions in front of the Lyceum building, where Meredith will try to register the next morning.
I drew this the day after the riot. It accompanied about a 10-page letter I sent my mother, who had graduated from Ole Miss in 1931. A crowd of students gathered in the area, the circle, right in front of the Lyceum building. I'd say there were 500 of us there. It was largely a curious crowd.
I just gotten out of the U.S. Air Force, and I went back to work at this little radio station in Fort Worth, and the station sent me down to Ole Miss to cover this story. I drove all night, got into Oxford on Sunday afternoon, and already there were crowds forming on the streets. I started hearing thuds against the side of the truck, and it turned out they were throwing rocks, beer bottles.
It began to get a little bit ugly. There were a few students who were provoking the situation, were taunting the marshal, throwing rocks.
The highway patrol, who had been there, suddenly left.
There are no highway patrolmen visible. The highway patrol cars evidently have all left the university.
Outsiders who had not been able to get onto the campus suddenly came pouring into the campus with their guns to defend the sovereignty of Mississippi or whatever they claimed they were doing.
As it stands now, any and all persons are going on the campus.
That evening, as chaos continues on campus, Kennedy attempts to calm the situation.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it.
Every public official, including myself, should be prepared to make the choice tonight whether he will submit or whether he is willing to go to jail.
I can hear one of the men talking right now. He said he almost got stoned to death. He said it looked just like a bunch of wild men.
As dark came on, they started throwing Molotov cocktails at the marshals. The marshals would then counter with tear gas.
Just the situation is bad. Marshals are still firing tear gas shells and floating all over the place.
That went on all night, tear gas, bullets, so oppressive. The only way we stayed the whole night is to get on our bellies. And if you got down real low, the tear gas would be above it. You could stay down there.
I understand the girl there that was shot with the gas pod has died. Is that true?
And then the worst thing that happened, we heard gunshots and realized there was a sniper, or at least one sniper, maybe two, who were up on the roof of one of the dorms, and they were shooting down into the crowd. You didn't know who they were going to shoot at. You didn't know where those bullets were going.
One of the people they hated most were journalists who were coming back and telling the outside world what things were like. And as a black reporter, there would be no way that I could have gotten on campus because it was just too dangerous.
As violence escalates, federal marshals escort Meredith to a campus dorm under heavy security. As chaos erupts at Ole Miss, President Kennedy appeals to Governor Barnett in a frantic bid to control the situation.
Now, you see, we got to get order up there, and that's what we thought was going to happen.
President, please, why don't you, can't you give an order to try to remove him?
How can I remove him, Governor, when there's a riot in the street? You may step out of that building and something happen to him. I can't remove him under those conditions.
People are wiring me and calling me saying, well, you've given up. I said, I had to say, no, I'm not giving up, and we'll win this fight, you understand? That's just the Mississippi people.
There is a degree of theater in the negotiations that are taking place between Governor Barnett and the Kennedy administration. And part of that political theater is predicated on the desire of both camps to not lose voters.
The next morning, federal troops began to enter Oxford.
The 101st Airborne Division was dropped into Oxford, Mississippi the morning of the riot. You had the 82nd Airborne Division. You had the 2nd Infantry Division. You had the 503rd Military Police Battalion and the 716th Military Police Battalion rushing in to try to save Meredith, save the town, and save the people, the city of Oxford, from being burned down, basically.
There were a line of Jeeps that were 12 wide all the way over the fields to the highway, which is a long way. They had taken this community and locked it down.
This is the story of a 29-year-old Black American military veteran manipulating the President of the United States, the Supreme Court of the United States, and the government of the state of Mississippi into a crisis that, in the end, opened the gates of higher education for all Americans, which is a spectacular, spectacular achievement.
By the time the troops restored order, 300 people had been arrested. More than 200 people were injured, including 30 gunshot wounds to federal marshals. 2 civilians were killed, including a journalist.
The reporter who was killed was from Agence France Presse. He had been sent there because somebody in his office, it was their day off.
Ray Gunter was a young man from Abbeville, Mississippi, and he came down to see what all the fuss was about. He was a local guy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That same morning, in the aftermath of the riot, Meredith begins his first day as a student at Ole Miss.
I can never forget seeing James step out of that dorm. And I thought at the time, golly, what a brave man, because hell, I was scared, and I was on the other side. But he was strong, steadfast, and made his way, and he was determined.
Sir, there's been a great deal of turmoil and conflict. 2 people have been killed. Do you have any feelings of guilt? Have you given it any second thoughts?
I'm very sorry that anyone had to get hurt or killed. But of course, I don't believe any of you believe that I had anything to do with that.
James Meredith came to my private office, and I accommodated the registration there. The governor was so obsessed with the idea of maintaining our way of life that that was the ultimate objective.
I felt that I had accomplished a small part of my mission.
It has taken 16 months and the largest mobilization of federal troops on U.S. soil since the Civil War. Ole Miss is no longer segregated.
At 9, I attended my first class. It was a course in colonial American history. I was a few minutes late and was given a seat at the back of the room. I remember a girl, the only girl there, I think, and she was crying, but it might have been from the tear gas in the room. I was crying from it myself.
I thought, gosh, I got to get a picture of him in the classroom. So I took a Nikon, I put it on my trench coat, and when James went into the first classroom, I just snapped as best I could. And the class began to empty, including the instructor. And there was James by himself. That was a powerful moment.
Meredith embarks on his studies, spurned by the vast majority of his fellow students. The threat of violence is ever present. Soon after Meredith begins his second semester, Meredith's close friend Medgar Evers is murdered. Shot in the back, in the driveway of his home.
I've had a number of threatening calls, people calling me saying that they were going to kill me, saying that they were going to blow my home up, and saying that I only had a few hours to live. I said, well, whenever my time comes, I'm ready.
Just a few months later, James reaches the goal that Medgar Evers helped him to realize.
James Howard Meredith.
Today, nearly 60 years later, 1 in 10 students at the University of Mississippi is African American.
Can I shake your hand, please?
I'm glad to see you here.
While integrating Ole Miss is a landmark victory,
Guess where I'm from? Cosmestico.
for James, the battle wasn't over.
The concept of civil rights is that we good white folks will help you get some of your rights, 3 or 4 of them, if you acknowledge that you don't have all the rights we do.
He always thought that the traditional vocabulary and imagery of the American civil rights movement was somehow indicated weakness or inferiority or supplication.
Civil rights is an insult to citizenship. Every citizen in the United States is entitled to every one of those rights.
His thing was, if you give me some civil rights, what about all the rest of the rights I'm supposed to have?
The psychology of violence is even more used than actual violence.
For Meredith, it was this overwhelming fear that he understood most blacks still experience in the Deep South when just trying to exercise basic civil rights. Even something as simple as getting a hamburger in a restaurant, and God forbid, trying to go to register to vote.
You understand, lynching had been a key factor of the fear, but it was almost finished in the 60s. But the fear was still there.
By 1966, just 5% of blacks in Mississippi are registered to vote. Asserting their right could be a dangerous undertaking. Meredith, determined to draw attention to the fear that black people experienced, embarks on his next great mission, a walk against fear.
James Meredith, a veteran Negro leader, set off on foot from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi to conquer fear, Meredith said.
He aims to walk 220 miles, encouraging blacks to register as he goes.
I call it my second assault on Mississippi.
The marches from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama the previous year had encouraged this form of protest. But true to character, Meredith has something different in mind. He will walk by himself.
He had informed other leaders of other organizations what he was going to do. And some of them scoffed at him, some laughed at him, and now some of them said, oh man, you know you can't do that, you're not gonna live, they're gonna kill you if they see a black man walking down an interstate.
When I told them what I was gonna do, they laughed. Said, go ahead on, dirt farmer, black from Mississippi with your ignorant self. And okay. You're all so smart and I'm so dumb, we're gonna see what happens.
He doesn't need anyone's permission to do it. Whether they agree with him or not, it doesn't matter to him because he's on a mission and he knows that he's on a mission.
Meredith had never conceived of this as a march or a demonstration. He made a sharp distinction between demonstrations and marches and what he was doing. And he basically said this walk against fear was to reclaim a right that every American should be entitled to. It was about reclaiming for blacks in Mississippi, and in fact, in America, the sense of being entitled to just the basic accoutrements of citizenship.
As Meredith had been in Ole Miss, he is one man, alone, seeking to change the world.
It was James Meredith in a pith helmet with a few dollars in his pocket and a cane, said, okay, I'm gonna walk across the state of Mississippi on my own with a few people behind me, and we're gonna demonstrate our courage, and the workers and the citizens of every town we go through, I'm gonna ask them to go register to vote. Now, registering to vote, even in 1966 in Mississippi, could get you, as a black man or woman, killed or fired. So it took a lot of guts to do what he was doing.
On the second day, he crosses the state line from Tennessee. The eyes of Mississippi are now upon him.
About the top of the hill, somebody came up and told me there's a man down there waiting, so he's gonna shoot you. I shook it off. I'd had many threats in my lifetime. It didn't bother me at all. And I got down here and I heard somebody say, James Meredith. Everybody else get out of the way. I only want James Meredith. And the man come up out of one of these ditches over there, and he shot me 2 times.
I'm hit in the leg, I know, and in the head. Ain't nobody gonna get me in the car. Here it comes right now. Here it is. Right in the car right here.
Police find a man with a shotgun hiding in the bushes.
The only thing significant to me at that point, he didn't kill me.
And no one asks him for an explanation, and none seems required.
Now, frankly, I did not plan to get shot. But after I got shot, everything I had hoped for happened.
The day after Meredith is shot, leaders fly into Memphis from all 5 of the nation's major civil rights organizations. The so-called Big Five have arrived in town. The movement has been splintering, with some pushing to turn up the heat on tactics.
The day of the sit-in, the lie-in, the crawl-in, the cry-in, and the beg-in is outdated.
And they do not agree on the next steps.
Dr. King does not want to repudiate any group, but he is put in an uncomfortable position by Floyd McKissick and Stokely Carmichael. They want a march in which blacks are going to take a leadership role, in which they will not eschew nonviolence, in which there should be armed self-defense. Whitney Young and Roy Wilkins can't sign on to this.
But the other question, could Stokely Carmichael use black power? And I said, Stokely Carmichael is a citizen. He can say anything he want to say.
This march that we are continuing, started by James Meredith, I am convinced will have as greater impact, or probably a greater impact, than the march from Selma to Montgomery.
Within days, his lone walk has transformed into a national event.
field hands and domestic workers joined the march as it passed their homes.
On June 16th, the marchers arrive at Greenwood, about 100 miles from Jackson.
At Greenwood, city officials first balked at granting a campsite, then decided to be helpful.
Okay to put the tent up.
After some negotiation, the marchers are able to camp on public land. But frustration is now at a peak.
Stokely Carmichael spoke louder and louder. He sounded the march's new rallying call, Black Power.
Hey, we want Black Power. We want Black Power.
Black Power didn't just appear in 1966. It had always been there. It was about Black empowerment. It was about Black pride, building up economic self-sufficiency in the African-American community.
A few days later, 3,500 marchers arrive in Canton. This time, officials refuse to allow camping on public land.
This is important. We're going to stick together. If necessary, we are willing to fill up all of the jails in the state of Mississippi.
When state troopers arrive, the marchers have no escape. Men, women, and children are gassed and beaten. But they remain unafraid and undeterred. By June 26, 1966, Meredith's lone walk across Mississippi has become a march of magnitude.
"20 days after he was wounded, Meredith rejoined the march as it approached Jackson.
The following day, the marchers arrive at their final destination, Mississippi State Capitol in Jackson.
Of the march that I started 3 weeks ago today was to point up and to challenge that thing at the base of the system of white supremacy. And that thing is fear.
Along the way, 4,000 Black Mississippians have registered to vote.
The Meredith March is going to have a very important impact in Mississippi in terms of empowering people to see the possibility of being able to go to register to vote.
Today, proportionately more Blacks than whites are registered to vote in Mississippi. The voter turnout amongst Blacks within the state has been beyond that of African Americans outside the South for decades.
But the vote is not for the voting. The vote is for getting what you need for the people. And we ain't even there yet.
Meredith triggers, through his own courage and his own taking a bullet for the cause, he triggers the last great march of the civil rights era.
In the years after 1966, James Meredith continues to forge his own unique path. Now based in New York, Meredith becomes a Republican candidate, challenges popular incumbent Adam Clayton Powell for a seat in Congress.
I only use the political arena as a platform to deliver a message. The last thing in the world I would have ever wanted was to be elected to anything.
By the 1970s, he turns his focus to Wall Street.
Since I left Mississippi 7 years ago, I've spent almost all of my time in New York studying how the capitalistic economic system works and about the accumulation and retaining of wealth. But this has not reached blacks. Everyone agrees with me
His decisions in later life have sometimes been unexpected. In 1989, he joins the staff of Senator Jesse Helms, an arch conservative who consistently opposed civil rights legislation.
James Meredith went to work for Jesse Helms, the former arch segregationist of the United States Senate. At the time, Jesse Helms had renounced segregation as a legal dominant theory in America. He had rejected it.
And in 1991, he endorses David Duke, former KKK leader, for governor of Louisiana.
I always thought my job was to convert bad white folks into good white folks. I consider one of my most significant victories converting David Duke from a Klansman to a former Klansman.
Duke, at the time, had renounced the Klan. James Meredith thought Duke was a former racist. Now, I think he was probably wrong there.
Meredith remains a free-thinking challenger to the status quo, not afraid to side with a perceived enemy in order to open up and face a debate. 43 years after he graduated, Ole Miss erected a statue to honor James Meredith.
Some of our students came together to discuss what could the university do, and they all felt we should have a civil rights monument.
Because of individuals like James Meredith.
We wanted the monument located between the Lyceum that rejected Mr. Meredith and the library that was Mr. Meredith's opportunity to gain knowledge. Oh, my favorite part of this was I looked out one day and there was a little child, probably 7 or 8, who was on a school tour, who was holding Mr. Meredith's statue hand. And I must tell you, I had tears that day.
Ole Miss has made progress since 1962.
I love Mississippi.
In July 2018, at the age of 85, James is inducted into the Ole Miss Alumni Hall of Fame.
They put James on the 50-yard line. The whole stadium stood up and just applauded. That is a heck of an accomplishment for Mississippi, and I hope it continues to go in that direction.
Meredith remains committed to the fight he started in Mississippi more than 50 years ago.
We got to have a new agenda if blacks are ever to become full citizens in this country and enjoy all of the rights and privileges.
The legacy of knowing that as a black person in America, there are chances you're going to have to take in order to bring about change.
The classic individual who believes it's their responsibility to interrogate and constantly push the boundaries of our democracy to make it better.
Not caring about what anybody else thinks about him. I think that's his legacy.
Ultimately, he forces us to confront one simple but profoundly powerful question.
Am I a citizen or am I not a citizen?